Open the door.
Go away.
Hana,
Don't call me that!
you're bleeding!
Good.
What happened?
Your family happened.
What did they do?
They sent me photos.
Photos of what?
Your fiancé. Jitae, why is there a picture of her standing beside your mother yesterday?
I can't explain.
No, explain this instead!
Where did you get these medical records?
I was never supposed to find out, right?
Hana,
The baby I lost 3 years ago wasn't an accident.
Who did this to me?
If you're new here, welcome to Amade's AfroK-Stories, where every episode is a full cinematic drama experience. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story drop. Now let's go back 5 months earlier. To the night two strangers were forced to share one bed. The rain arrived before Hana did. It came in sheets, cold and indifferent, drumming against the black iron gates of the Choi estate like a warning nobody had the sense to take seriously. The mansion sat behind those gates the way power always sat, elevated, lit from within, designed to make everyone approaching it feel smaller than they actually were. Hana Bello stepped out of the black car with one bag on her shoulder and rain already ruining her silk blouse. She stood at the base of the stone steps and looked up at the building like she was deciding whether to enter a fight she could win. She decided she could. She always decided that. The housekeeper, a short woman named Mrs. Yoon with silver-threaded hair and careful eyes, met her at the top of the steps with an umbrella that arrived 3 seconds too late to matter. Miss Bello, Mr. Choi is waiting in the east wing. Of course he is, Hana said, following her inside without breaking stride. The interior of the Choi mansion smelled like money that had been sitting still long enough to develop a personality. Dark wood paneling, oil paintings in gilded frames, a staircase that curved upward like an architectural statement of superiority. Hana had photographed palaces in Lagos and boardrooms in London, and none of them had made her feel quite this deliberately watched. Choi Jitae was standing at the far end of the east wing sitting room with his back to her when she walked in. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from photographs, with a kind of stillness that came not from calm but from practice. He wore a dark gray shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he didn't turn around when she entered. She stopped in the middle of the room. "You could at least pretend to be a decent host," she said. He turned then. And whatever she'd been prepared to feel when she saw his face, irritation, professional distance, the polite contempt she'd spent 3 days rehearsing, none of it arrived on schedule. His face was more angular than the press photos suggested. His eyes were darker. And the way he looked at her wasn't cold exactly. It was searching. Like he was looking for something he wasn't sure he'd find. "You're wet," he said. "Your driver was late." "The rain wasn't." A pause. "Sit down. I'd rather stand for this conversation." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Suit yourself." He picked up a folder from the side table and crossed the room, stopping just close enough to hand it to her without invading her space. "The contract. Legal reviewed it this morning. It's clean." Hana took it without looking at him and flipped through the pages with the efficiency of someone who'd read too many documents to be impressed by official language. The terms were what her lawyer had negotiated. 6 months, full financial independence, access to the Choi archives for her documentary project, and enough monthly compensation to fund her work for 2 years afterward. In exchange, she would play his wife convincingly enough to satisfy his family's inheritance clause. One legitimate marriage. Documented. Witnessed. Real enough to hold up in court. "The bedroom arrangement," she said, stopping on a specific clause. "One master bedroom," Jitae said. "The family staff reports directly to my mother. If any of them suspect the marriage isn't genuine, the clause becomes void. So the entire estate pretends we share a room. The entire estate believes we share a room. There's a difference." Hana looked up at him for the first time directly. "And what's the actual arrangement?" "I'll take the floor. You take the bed." He said it the way someone stated a weather forecast. Without drama. without expectation. I've done worse. She held his gaze for a moment, looking for the angle, for whatever he was hiding underneath the composure. She found nothing obvious, which meant either he was an exceptional liar or the situation genuinely was what it appeared to be. Neither option made her fully comfortable. Fine, she said, closing the folder. We sign tomorrow. We sign tonight. He turned back toward the window. My mother arrives from Seoul in 48 hours. She'll want to meet you immediately. We need to have been living here at least 3 days before she walks through that door. Hana exhaled through her nose. You could have told me that before I agreed to this. You would have negotiated for more money. Yes, she said simply. I would have. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, but the faint outline of respect. The contract already has your number, Miss Bello. Don't push the boundary. Mr. Choi, she said, picking up her bag. I haven't found my boundary yet. She signed the contract at 11:47 that night. By midnight, she was standing in the largest bedroom she'd ever occupied, staring at the emperor-sized bed and the floor Jite had already claimed with military-folded bedding that looked more deliberate than apologetic. You actually sleep on the floor, she said. I told you I would. I assumed it was a figure of speech. He was already lying down, one arm behind his head, eyes on the ceiling. Get some sleep. My mother's people will check the room for signs of cohabitation before she arrives. Put your things in the closet. Hana stood there a moment longer than made sense, looking at a man who owned 40% of the most valuable real estate portfolio in Seoul choosing the hardwood floor of his own mansion. She didn't ask why, but she didn't stop thinking about it either. She woke in the night to the sound of a door. Not the main door, something quieter. A side door, barely audible, the kind of sound that registered not as a sound but as a change in the quality of silence. Hana lay still, heartbeat climbing, eyes open in the dark. Nothing moved. She sat up slowly and looked across the room. Jite was still on the floor, completely motionless. Either he hadn't heard it or he slept through everything. She told herself it was the old house settling. The way large buildings always creaked and exhaled at night like living things. She told herself that and almost believed it. In the morning she found her camera bag moved. Not missing. Not searched. Just shifted, 3 inches from where she'd placed it against the wardrobe. The zipper at a slightly different angle than she left it. Hana had spent years working in environments where noticing small wrong things kept you safe. She noticed this. She said nothing. But she started keeping count. The second day brought Jite's secretary. A precise young man named Park who delivered schedules and talking points for the family dinner with the efficiency of someone who understood that efficiency was the closest thing to affection he could offer. Hana absorbed everything without notes. Names, relationships, historical grievances she was expected to already know, while Jite sat across the dining table reviewing documents and occasionally correcting Park's information with the weariness of someone who'd memorized the wrong version of his own family story one too many times. His aunt, Hana said mid-briefing, doesn't like the Hong Kong properties. Park blinked. That's yes. How did you? The way you paused before mentioning her. Like you were deciding how much to say. She looked at Jite. People always pause before the complicated ones. Jite set down his document and looked at her with that same searching expression from the first night. You notice a lot. I'm a photographer. It's structural. Most photographers notice light. I notice what light reveals, she said, and turned back to Park. Continue. The chemistry between them arrived the way weather arrived in the mansion, without announcement and entirely unwelcome. Started with small things. The way Jite held the door open with his whole body, not just his hand, creating a space she walked through that felt specifically shaped for her. The way she started leaving coffee outside the office where he worked late without discussing it, and he started drinking it without commenting. And somehow both of them understood this was not a kindness but a negotiation. Late on the third night, she found him in the library at 2 a.m, not reading, just sitting, one lamp burning, the house completely quiet around him. You don't sleep, she said from the doorway. I sleep enough. She came inside and sat in the chair across from his. How long have you been doing that? The floor, I mean. Why not the second guest suite? He was quiet for a moment. There was a version of my life where I slept in that room with someone I chose. I don't use it anymore. Hana absorbed this. She didn't push. The library doesn't bother you? The library was mine before the empire was. He looked at the shelves. I used to read for hours in here when I was a child. Before anyone had opinions about how I spent my time. Something about the way he said it, unguarded, almost accidental, made her chest do something she immediately categorized as none of her business. I do the same with darkrooms, she said. The smell of developer fluid. Hours alone with negatives. It's the only place nothing asks anything of me. He looked at her then, and the searching expression was there again but softer this time. Like he'd found one edge of whatever he was looking for. You should sleep, he said. So should you. Neither of them moved for another 20 minutes. She was photographing the garden on the fourth morning when she found the camera. She'd been framing a shot through the west-facing window of the sitting room when something caught her eye inside the large flower arrangement on the bookshelf. A slight reflection, circular, wrong. She set her camera down and crossed the room and extracted the device from between the stems so carefully that whoever had placed it would never know it had been found. It was small. Professional grade. The kind of surveillance equipment that didn't come from electronics shops. Her first instinct was Jite. Her second instinct, arriving half a second later, was no. Because if Jite wanted to monitor her, he didn't need hidden cameras. She was already living in his house, wearing his name, sleeping 12 feet from him every night. He had access by contract. This was someone else's surveillance. Someone watching not just her but the room itself, the conversations that happened in it, the space between two people who were supposed to be in love. She placed the camera in her pocket and found Jite in his office. She closed the door, crossed the room, and set the device on his desk without speaking. He stared at it for a long moment. Where? He said. The east sitting room. Flower arrangement. Your housekeeper's arrangement, the one from Tuesday. His jaw tightened in a way that told her he was controlling a significant reaction. I didn't put this here. I know. He looked up at her sharply. You know. You would have picked a better location. She held his gaze. Who else has access to this wing? He said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, everyone. The mansion had 12 full-time staff. Jite's mother would arrive in less than 24 hours. And somewhere inside these walls someone was watching. He disabled the camera. He didn't replace it. He didn't report it. And Hana noted all 3 of those choices the way she noted everything. Quietly, without expression, adding it to the weight of evidence she was still building a case for. Madame Choi arrived like weather that had been predicted, and was still somehow a shock when it hit. She was 61 and beautiful in the aggressive way of women, who understood beauty as a weapon they'd been sharpening for decades. She wore ivory and moved through the mansion like she owned it, which, technically, she still did until the inheritance clause was satisfied. Her eyes found Hana within seconds of entering the main hall, and didn't let go. So, she said in Korean that Park translated with careful neutrality, you're the woman my son chose. I'm the woman your son married, Hana said. In Korean she'd spent 4 days quietly practicing. There's a difference. Madame Choi's expression didn't change. But something in her eyes did. Jite, standing beside Hana, put his hand at the small of her back. The first time he'd touched her deliberately, and the warmth of it traveled up her spine before she could categorize it as contractual. Dinner that evening was a performance with excellent food. Madame Choi asked questions with the precision of someone conducting an interrogation inside a social gathering. Hana answered everything with documentary photographer's clarity. Truthful about herself, warm about Jite, never overplaying. She'd done enough conflict zone interviews to know that the most dangerous questions were the ones asked in soft voices. It was only later, back in the bedroom, that she exhaled. You studied Korean, Jite said, not a question. I study everything I need to. He was quiet a moment. Then, she believed it. She wanted to believe it. That's easier to work with. He sat on the edge of the bed, the first time he'd sat on it rather than the floor, and ran one hand through his hair with a tiredness that was entirely unperformed. She asked Park this afternoon whether you seemed genuinely attached to me. What did he say? That you put coffee outside my office without being asked. Hana said nothing. She found it convincing, Jite said. It was convincing because it was true. The words sat in the air between them for a moment before she moved past them toward the wardrobe. She felt him watching her. Not the way his mother watched with calculation, but with something quieter and considerably more dangerous. That night, lying awake in the dark, she heard him humming. Low, almost below conscious thought, the kind of humming that happened when the body remembered something the mind had put down. A melody she couldn't name but knew the shape of, the way you knew the shape of a word in a language you'd almost forgotten. She lay completely still. "Jite," she said quietly. The humming stopped. "Yes. That melody." Silence. "Why does it feel familiar to me?" The silence that followed lasted too long. Long enough that she turned her head toward the floor where he lay, even though she couldn't see him in the dark. "Old song," he said finally. "You probably heard it somewhere." But his voice was flat in a way it never was. Controlled in a way that required effort. She didn't push. But she lay awake for another 2 hours, the melody turning over and over in the cavity behind her sternum, looking for the door it was meant to open. The flashback started small. A scent, rain and hospital antiseptic, arriving out of nowhere on a cloudless afternoon while she was walking the garden. A sound, glass breaking, that made her flinch 3 full seconds before she realized there was no broken glass anywhere near her. Fragments with no frame, pieces of imagery that arrived and departed too quickly to examine. She'd had episodes like this before in the years since the accident. Her doctor and Legos called them intrusive memory sequences. The brain attempting to reconstruct experiences that the trauma had shattered and scattered. She'd learned to document them like she documented everything. Observationally, without getting inside them. But these felt different. These felt like they were getting stronger. On the 7th day, she found the photograph. She was looking for a lens filter she'd packed into a jacket she'd worn on the flight, and the jacket had been folded into the bottom of the wardrobe, and beneath the jacket was a book she didn't recognize. A slim volume with a broken spine as if it had been opened to the same page many times. She opened it. A photograph fell out. Her own face looked up at her from the floor. She picked it up with numb fingers and stood very still for a long time. It was her, younger, maybe 24, 25, with shorter hair and the specific kind of open joy on her face that she associated with a version of herself she barely remembered being. She was laughing at something off camera, genuinely laughing, the kind that reached the eyes first. Standing beside her with his hand in hers was Choi Ji-tae. Her legs found the edge of the bed. She sat down. Her hands were not entirely steady as she turned the photo over and read the date on the back in handwriting she didn't recognize. Seoul. March. 4 years ago. She had no memory of Seoul. She had no memory of this photograph. She had no memory of standing anywhere near this man before the contract brought her through his gates in the rain. But the woman in the photograph had her face in his hand and looked like someone who had found exactly what she was looking for. She was sitting in the same position when Ji-tae returned an hour later. She held up the photograph without speaking. She watched his face. And she saw the thing he'd been holding back since the first night. Not just behind his composure but buried under layers of deliberate architecture. Finally crack open. "Sit down," she said quietly. He sat. And then Choi Ji-tae, who controlled 40% of Seoul's real estate and never explained himself to anyone, told her the truth. They had met in Seoul 4 years ago at a gallery opening. She'd been shooting a documentary on urban development. He'd been avoiding a bored dinner. They'd argued for 2 hours about whether architecture was art or apology, and then had coffee that lasted until 3 in the morning and then saw each other every day for 4 months. Secretly. Because Madame Choi had been engineering a match with a rival family's daughter since Ji-tae was 22. And because Ji-tae had known that bringing Hana into the light of the Choi family would put her in the center of something she hadn't agreed to fight. "You were the first person," he said, "who talked to me like the empire didn't exist." She was listening with her hands folded carefully in her lap, and her face absolutely controlled and the photograph sitting between them on the bed. "There was an accident," she said. "Yes. After which I lost certain memories." His jaw tightened. "Yes. The accident that took our..." She stopped. Rebuilt the sentence. "There was a pregnancy." The air left the room. "I remember it," she said slowly. "The way I remember something that happened to someone else. A loss. A clinical loss. At the time I had no relationship context for it. My records said I was involved in a car accident. That the pregnancy didn't survive the trauma. Jite was not moving. That's what the records said, she said. The records your family provided to the hospital. He closed his eyes. Jite. Her voice didn't break. She'd spent 3 years building the architecture that kept her voice from breaking. Was the miscarriage from the accident? Or was the accident arranged to cause the miscarriage? The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. I didn't know, he said. I want you to understand, I was told the accident was random. I was told you survived and that the pregnancy, I was told you were recovering and that you'd chosen to, that you needed space. He stopped. Rebuilt. By the time I was told you'd left the country, the records had been filed. I spent 8 months trying to find you. Your mother. He said nothing. She arranged it. He looked at the window. His profile in the lamplight was the architecture of a man deciding whether honesty was the same as destruction. I didn't know until 3 weeks ago. A board member's assistant, someone with access she shouldn't have had, sent me a file. The original hospital intake records. Before they were amended. What did they say? That the accident didn't cause the miscarriage. His voice was low and even and cost him something to produce. That there was a procedure administered without your knowledge or consent. At the facility you were transferred to. A facility that receives significant funding from the Choi Family Foundation. The room was very quiet. Hana's hands were still folded. Her face was still controlled. But something behind her eyes had shifted. Not to grief, not yet, but to the specific and clarifying fury of someone who has found the shape of a thing they always suspected. That's why you arranged this contract, she said. I needed you inside the house. Inside the family documentation. To access the original files before my mother could destroy what remains. You used me. I told myself it was the only way. He looked at her directly. I was wrong. I should have come to you directly. I should have told you everything before you signed anything. Yes, she said. You should have. She stood. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, and the rain had started again outside. The same rain that had been falling the night she arrived, and she pressed one hand flat against the glass. I need to see everything you have. Hana, don't manage me right now. I need to see the files. He brought her the files. They sat at the library table until 4 a.m. with documents spread between them and Hana working through everything with the methodical precision of someone who had spent a decade building narratives from fragments. Jite answered every question she asked and didn't explain what she didn't ask about, and brought her tea once, quietly, and she drank it without looking up. The records were clear in the way that truly damning things were always clear once you knew how to read them. Madame Choi had identified Hana within weeks of the relationship beginning. She had leveraged the family's medical connections. The accident had been manufactured. Not the crash itself, which had been real, but the conditions surrounding the hospital transfer, the attending physicians, the paperwork that preceded the procedure Hana had never consented to and never been told about. A child. Erased from the record before it could become a claim on the Choi succession. And then Hana herself, erased from Jite's life through manipulated documentation and distance, and the exploitation of a young woman recovering from trauma, who had no reason to disbelieve what the medical professionals around her were saying. At 4:15, Hana set the last document down. She still thinks she succeeded, she said. Yes. She thinks I'm just a contractor. A stranger who signed for money. Yes. Hana looked at the photograph on the table between them, the one of herself laughing in Seoul with her hand in his. She looked at it for a long time. That's useful, she said. And something in Jite's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite hope but was standing very close to it. What happened next between them was not sudden. It was the opposite of sudden. It was the slow, inevitable thing that had been building since the first night. Since the melody and the coffee and the 2 a.m. library, and all the small careful negotiations of two people who were trying to be honest without being vulnerable and failing at the second part in the best possible way. She was reviewing archive photographs in the study 3 days later when he came to stand beside her, close enough that she was aware of the specific warmth of him, and looked at the images spread across the desk. This one, he said, touching the edge of a photograph she'd taken from the Choi Estate archive. An early picture of the mansion in construction, the bones of it visible, the stone not yet finished. This is what it looked like before my grandfather added the east wing. He built the east wing. For my grandmother. She wanted a music room. He paused. She played badly and loudly and apparently refused to stop, so he built her a room far enough from his study that he could concentrate. Hana looked at him sideways. He built her a soundproofed annex instead of asking her to stop. He was not a man who asked people to stop being themselves. She returned to the photograph. What happened to her? She outlived him by 30 years. She kept playing badly and loudly. The staff complained constantly. His voice was quiet. She said a house that was too silent was a house that had forgotten itself. Hana set the photograph down and turned to face him, and the distance between them was not very large. Jite. Yes. When I was in the accident, the real part of the accident before the hospital. Do you know what happened exactly? Something moved through his face. You were driving back from a meeting near Itaewon. A vehicle forced yours off the road. The driver fled. You were unconscious when the paramedics arrived. He stopped. I was at a board meeting. I received a call. I left the meeting. He stopped again. She waited. I wasn't allowed to see you. At the hospital. My mother had already arrived. She told the staff we were not in a relationship. That I was a concerned acquaintance. The muscle at his jaw worked. They followed her instructions. I stood outside for 4 hours. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. He went completely still. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for what they did to you too. He turned his face very slightly into her hand. Just slightly. Like a man who hadn't been touched gently in a very long time, and was managing the information carefully. I should have protected you, he said. You were 28 and they were your family. She lowered her hand. We were both 28 and they had all the power. That's not on you. It's partly on me. Yes, she said. Partly. You don't get to carry all of it alone. That evening, she let herself stop documenting what she felt and simply feel it. It arrived not as a decision but as a recognition, the way you recognized a face you'd known in different lighting. The love hadn't died. It had gone underground the way certain plants survived extreme conditions, by conserving everything, by becoming nearly invisible, by waiting in the dark for conditions to change. The conditions had changed. Jite was in the library when she found him, and she didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway until he looked up. And whatever was in her face was enough because he set the book down and stood. She crossed the room. He met her halfway. The reunion was quiet and fierce and entirely honest in the way that only things that have survived real loss manage to be. Not innocent because they were past innocence, but true in the way that mattered more. Later, much later, she lay with her head against his shoulder in the dark and the rain had finally stopped and the mansion was genuinely quiet for the first time since she'd arrived. I remember the song now, she said. She felt his chest move. You used to hum it when you were working, she said. In your apartment in Itaewon. The one with the window that didn't close properly. The heating was broken half the winter. You had 2 blankets and a broken heater, and you gave me the better blanket every single time. It was cold. You were also cold. You were colder. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. Jite, we have to finish this. I know. Your mother is still in this house. The person who planted the camera is still in this house. And whatever she's planning for when the inheritance clause completes, she'll move against us the moment she suspects the marriage is real. Then we don't give her time to suspect. We act first. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the full records. Not just what she hid from me. The board members who received payment from the foundation during the period of the original cover-up. If I can prove the suppression was systematic. There are 3 names in the files, Hana said. I recognize the financial structures. I've documented corruption networks before. I know what the paper trail looks like. She lifted her head. Give me 48 hours. He looked at her in the dark. You became a documentary photographer documenting corruption networks. I became a documentary photographer after someone erased my life. She held his gaze. I wanted to understand how erasure works. Turns out I got very good at it. The 48 hours were precise and deliberate and resulted in a documentation package that Hana assembled with the focused calm of someone conducting the most important interview of their professional life. which in all meaningful ways it was. She pulled financial records from the estate's administrative archive, using the access her contract provided. She cross-referenced them against the medical facility documents. She built a chain of evidence clean enough and structured enough to walk a judge through in under an hour. Jite coordinated with the family's independent legal counsel, a firm his mother didn't control and had never thought to worry about, and a board member who'd been uncomfortable with Madame Choi's methods for a decade and needed only the right moment to say so. The moment arrived on a Thursday morning in the mansion's formal boardroom. Madame Choi took her seat at the table with the composure of a woman who had controlled the room for 30 years, and saw no reason today should be different. Jite sat across from her. Hana sat beside him. The legal counsel set the documents on the table. Madame Choi looked at them and then looked at her son, and her expression was the expression of someone who understood what was happening before the first word was spoken. Jite gave her the dignity of allowing her to read it herself. He let the silence last until she looked up. "A family," he said quietly, "that was built on destroying the woman I love deserves to collapse." He held her gaze. "I'm not collapsing it for revenge. I'm collapsing it because anything built on what you did doesn't deserve to stand." Madame Choi said nothing. "The inheritance clause will be fulfilled," he continued. "The marriage is real. You made sure of that when you brought her back into my life by threatening to invoke the clause without a legitimate marriage. You built this. All of it." He set his hands flat on the table. "The board will vote with full knowledge of the documented misconduct. The foundation funding to the medical facility will be investigated, and you will be given the opportunity to step down before that investigation becomes public. Or," Madame Choi said very quietly, "there is no or. There is only what you choose to do in the next 24 hours. She stood. She was still graceful. She would probably always be graceful. It was structural, like Hana's ability to notice things. She looked at Hana for a long moment with the expression of a woman recalculating everything she'd thought she'd controlled. Then she left the room. Jite's ex-fiancé had been waiting in the corridor. Hana wasn't surprised. She'd been the one to find the connection, buried in the cover-up documentation. Payments made to a personal account during the period following the accident, small enough to look like nothing, numerous enough to tell a story. The ex-fiancé had known. Not arranged, known and stayed quiet, and accepted the benefits of Hana's disappearance. She looked at Hana in the corridor with the expression of someone who had spent a long time knowing a reckoning was coming, and had never quite managed to prepare for it anyway. "I was young," she said. "So was I," Hana said. "So was the child they took." There was nothing else to say. Hana walked past her. The board meeting lasted 3 hours. 3 days later, the restructuring was filed. A week after that, Hana was standing in the East Wing sitting room, the room where she'd found the hidden camera, where the flower arrangement had held someone else's eyes, and she was photographing the window light the way it fell across the floor in the late afternoon, not for documentation but for the pleasure of it. The simple pleasure of a beautiful image that didn't need to prove anything. Jite came in without announcement and stood in the doorway watching her work. "You're smiling," he said. "The light is good. You always say that when you don't want to admit you're happy." She lowered the camera and turned to look at him. "I'm happy." He crossed the room. He had the easy movement of a man who was no longer carrying something he'd been carrying for 4 years. She'd noticed it 3 days ago, the way his shoulders sat differently, the way he occupied his own space differently, like a house that had finally been told it was allowed to be a home. He stood close to her and put his hands on either side of her face. "We should go somewhere," he said. "After everything is filed. Somewhere that isn't this house. I want to go back to Seoul." Something moved across his face. "Yes. The gallery district. I want to photograph it properly this time." She held his gaze. "And the apartment with the broken window. That building was demolished." "I know. I want to photograph the site." He understood. He always understood the thing she was doing underneath the thing she was saying. "Then Seoul," he said. She was still looking at him when her phone rang. She picked it up without breaking eye contact, expecting administration, expecting legal, expecting any of the dozens of practical threads that still needed pulling. It was a doctor's office. "Mrs. Choi." The voice was professionally warm, the warmth of a practitioner delivering information they couldn't fully predict the response to. This is Dr. Lim's office. We've completed the review of your recent fertility scan, and we wanted to speak with you about the findings. Hana went still. The original assessment from 3 years ago indicated permanent damage from the procedure. However, the imaging we completed last week suggests the initial assessment may not have been entirely accurate. Another pause. Careful. There may still be a possibility, Mrs. Choi. It would require consultation, but there may be a possibility. Jitae saw her face change. She lowered the phone slowly, and then the doorbell rang. They both looked toward the entrance hall. Jitae crossed to the front door and opened it. 2 officers from the Seoul Metropolitan Police stood on the step with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had learned to deliver unexpected information without editorializing. Mr. Choi Jitae? The senior officer said. Yes. We're sorry to disturb you, sir. We're trying to locate Choi Soo-jin. He paused. Your mother. She was scheduled to appear for a preliminary compliance meeting this morning and failed to arrive. Her personal staff report she left the property last night and has not returned. Jitae said nothing. We're initiating a formal inquiry, the officer said. At this stage it's precautionary, but we wanted to inform you directly. The officer said something further about contact information and ongoing notifications. Hana heard the words without fully assembling them. She was looking at the light across the entrance hall floor, the same light she'd been photographing, and she was thinking about a woman who had spent 30 years building a structure and watched it dismantle in a single morning. The officers left. Jitae closed the door. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and when he turned, his face was the face of a man who had run out of simple feelings about complicated things. She crossed the entrance hall and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She put her hand in his, the way she had in the photograph, the way she had in Seoul in the life someone had tried to take from them both. He held it. Outside, the gates of the Choi estate stood open in the afternoon light. The rain had been gone for days. The garden was alive with the specific stubborn abundance of things that grew back after being cut down. And in the East Wing sitting room, her camera sat on the windowsill, still catching the light. That's the end of today's story. And if you made it all the way here, you already know this channel is built different. Subscribe to AfroK Stories for a brand new cinematic episode every single week. Drop a comment. Who broke your heart more? Jitae for keeping the secret? Or Madam Choi for everything else? The next story is already coming. Don't miss it.